Hi, everybody. This is Sue Klein. I'm co-president of the Clearinghouse on Women's Issues, and we're delighted today, April 23rd, to have two wonderful expert presenters on Christian nationalism. They are Katherine Stewart and Andrew Seidel. And I'll just give you a little introduction to what we plan for the meeting. We plan to address the 4 questions that were in the invitation announcement to this meeting. And Katherine is going to be the lead presenter on questions number 1 and number 3, and Andrew on number 2 and 4. And they will both respond to all of the questions, but have the first person, the lead responder, give the most information on the response to that. And then after all the presentations on the 4 questions, we'll have a Q&A. So you can ask enter your questions in the chat, and Jan Erickson, our other co-president of the Clearinghouse on Women's Issues, will be fielding the questions to the panelists. And we want to thank you all for coming and for learning with us about how we can fight all of the bad things that are in Christian nationalism. Anything I forgot? Anybody? Okay. Katherine, you all have the brief bios of our wonderful presenters in your invitation letter, so I won't go into details, but Katherine is a very distinguished author and journalist on many issues, and often on feminist related issues in particular. And she knows a great deal about Christian nationalism and has written books on it and is writing one currently. So Katherine, if you'll take away the first question, I'll just read it again so it'll be on everybody's mind. We asked Katherine to define Christian nationalism and help us understand its history and how it relates to other forms of Christianity, such as evangelicalism and fundamentalism of many religions, not just Christianity, and how it differs from other religions, religious adherence to Christianity or other religions that don't advocate religious nationalism. Katherine, if you'll take it away, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sue. I want to thank all of you for being here today. I want to thank the Feminist Majority Foundation and the Clearinghouse on Women's Issues for hosting this conversation. All feminists and supporters of democracy should fear Christian nationalism. I also want to thank my friend and co-speaker, Andrew Seidel, for joining with me today. So what is Christian nationalism? There are 2 pieces of it. I think of it as a mindset and also a machine. So the mindset starts with the ideology that America was founded as a Christian nation, and our laws should be based on a reactionary reading of the Bible. But this mindset includes at least 4 other elements. There is a kind of catastrophism, the sense that the country is under threat by liberals and secularists, and we're on the edge of an apocalypse. The second is a sense of persecution. This mindset includes the idea that the most persecuted group in America are white, supposedly, conservative Christians, and that anyone to the left of them, is coming after them. A third element, of course, is the belief in the foundational superiority of a sort of white Christian America, which involves a very mythologized reading of American history and distortions of constitutional law. And a fourth component is this affinity for authoritarian leadership. Basically, this is a group that falls for the promises of an authoritarian strongman who's going to defeat the enemy by any means necessary. So this is not, Christian nationalism is not a religion. It's not all of Christianity. It's really a mindset that can be easily exploited because, this is a leadership-driven movement, and you have this cadre raising huge amounts of money to funnel into the machine, which I'm going to describe, and sort of stoking these anxieties and then cashing in on them. So when it comes to the machine of Christian nationalism, it's about politics, it's about power, it's leadership-driven and organization-driven. The movement consists of this dense organizational ecosystem made up of various different groups that we can categorize. There are sort of right-wing think tanks, policy groups, networking organizations that get members of the leadership on the same page. There's a vast legal ecosystem that grooms and promotes far-right justices and pushes cases intended to destroy separation of church and state, which Andrew is going to talk about later. There are data initiatives that are used to turn out voters who are favorable to this message. And of course, there's that far-right messaging or propaganda sphere that draws people into the mindset and then turns them out during election cycles. And a really critical piece of this machine are the tens of thousands of pastors who are drawn into these intensely political networks, who then turn around and turn out their congregations to vote their supposedly biblical values. But on a separate or higher layer, there are these leaders who cultivate the pastors and other people more broadly, and that includes some number of sort of funders of the movement. The movement is incredibly well funded. So that's what Christian nationalism is, and hopefully I've explained also what it's not. And I'll just do a very brief rundown of the history. There have long been strains of reactionary religion fused with identitarian nationalism in America. So, for example, in the 1920s, the American clergyman and far-right populist Gerald K. Smith, he was a white supremacist. He started a movement called the America First Party. He's a member of the KKK. He appeared to be supportive of Hitler's rise to power. He actually ran for president on a ticket called the Christian Nationalist Party. Now, he failed to win his bid, and he sort of faded into history. But, there have been folks like that throughout our history. But Christian nationalism in its present form, the sort of machine piece of it, I would say, can be traced to a movement in the late 1970s and early 1980s called the New Right. This is a group of activists, including people like you guys know who Phyllis Schlafly is, Paul Weyrich, Richard Viguerie, and others. They felt the Republican Party had become too liberal, too soft on communism. They felt like changes in America's social fabric were very threatening. They were also really upset about the IRS's threat to revoke the tax-privileged status of segregated schools. I mean, this was the issue that really got them up in the morning, the idea that these religious schools run by people like Bob Jones Sr., Jerry Falwell, these segregated faith schools should lose their tax privileges. I mean, remember, people like Bob Jones called segregation God's established order. And a lot of the folks who were leaders in the New Right appeared to be in agreement with this. But they needed to find an issue that would ignite a kind of hyper-conservative counter-revolution and drag the Republican Party to the right and drag American religion to the right. So they saw potential in the abortion issue to unite various strands of their movement, thanks in part to the work of Phyllis Schlafly, who recognized that the abortion issue had the ability to activate gender anxieties, which are so much at the core of this movement. Whereas a message like stop the tax on segregation. I mean, like, don't tax segregation, wasn't really an issue that was going to draw a lot of supporters. It was just so ugly. So over time, they really purged these pro-choice voices from the Republican Party. It took a lot of work because at the time, most Protestant Republicans supported abortion rights. In fact, Phyllis Schlafly wrote a book titled How the Republican Party Became Pro-Life. It's a fascinating read because what it shows that the Republican Party was not anti-abortion at the time. It was not pro-life. So, this book really shows that what we see today is a pro-life religion in a way. It sort of like unites across denominations, but the idea that, abortion is the greatest moral issue of our time, that's really a modern creation, and it was created for political purposes.
Wow. A lot of information that I didn't know ever before. Andrew, do you want to add on?
Sure. I mean, first, I would like to echo Katherine's heartfelt thanks. And yeah, I'll add just a few things. I mean, such a good answer. I mean, I think the number one thing that people need to understand, and that I would like everybody listening to take away from our talk here, is that Christian nationalism is an existential threat to our democracy. And it's a personal threat to anybody who is not a Christian nationalist. And, Katherine and I can get into some of the fun things that this movement is trying to do to broaden its demographics in an attempt to seem like something it's not. But at the end of it, anyone who is not a conservative, white, heterosexual Christian man is going to be a target, is going to be marginalized and subjugated. That's really the goal. And, there's sort of a running joke kind of in Katherine and I's circle. There's like, you get different definitions of Christian nationalism if you ask a sociologist or a journalist or a Christian. And my perspective is slightly different. Like I've been kind of on the fighting Christian nationalist side, as Katherine mentioned, like doing battle in the courts and in the court of public opinion. And so for me, like a couple of the useful elements, one, Katherine already pointed it out, that it's the idea of a Christian nation, right? That is what gives this ideology its name. It is integral. They believe we were founded as a Christian nation and based on Christian principles. And second, that we've strayed from that foundation, right? That we've gotten away from our godly roots. And so they use the language of return, of getting back to a golden age, of getting back to godly roots, getting back to the way America was, making America great again, right? To justify all of this hateful and unpopular public policy. And the third element that I think is really crucial is that the ideology acts as a permission structure. And that's partly because it is based in religious beliefs and identity. They believe this is their country given to them by their God. So anything that goes against that is against the will of God. Right? And that gives them permission to subjugate the innate humanity and empathy in pursuit of power, right? Think of the Muslim ban. Think of the child separation policy at the border, which they justified publicly in press conferences by citing the Bible, by citing Romans 13. And lastly, the scariest part of that permission structure is that violence is almost inevitable when it collides with a belief system that holds that God has given them this country and that anything that thwarts that is against God's will, and that therefore it can be stopped at all costs, right? When violence and a belief system like that collide, when reality and a belief system like that collide, violence is almost inevitable. But I'll leave it there because Katherine's answer was so good.
Okay. Wow. And the second question goes to Andrew to discuss. And as you all probably remember, Andrew is a lawyer with Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. So he's going to discuss this question of the importance of the separation of church and state in acting as a bulwark against Christian nationalism. And he may get into the question that a lot of us are very familiar with, is how to make sure that the Equal Rights Amendment is in the U.S. Constitution, and how that is quite a contrast to the idea of Christian nationalism. Andrew, if you'll educate us from a lawyer's perspective and longtime scholar of Christian nationalism, we'd appreciate it.
I would love to. I mean, this is where I start to get really excited, because the wall of separation between church and state is an American original, right? That is an American invention. The idea was floating around in the Enlightenment, but it was first implemented in the American experiment. Until then, no other nation in the history of humanity had sought to protect the ability of its citizens to think freely by separating religion and government. And I genuinely think that's something that we can be proud of. We should be proud of. And we shouldn't let people undermine it with myths about a Christian founding. And if you look at our Constitution, many of the truly unique and original elements of that Constitution are secular. Our Constitution was the first to declare that power comes from people, not gods. Right? So those first three words that are emphasized right there on the parchment, we the people, they're poetic, but they're also so much more. They are a declaration of power, of where that power comes from. Our Constitution was the first governing document not to mention a god or a deity. And it's godless by choice, not by accident. And in fact, there were people in the founding generation who objected to that choice. And we've seen in the previous waves of Christian nationalism throughout American history that Katherine mentioned, right? There have been several waves, that one of the things Christian nationalists try to do is change that. And they try to inject Jesus Christ into the preamble of the Constitution. Our Constitution was the first to ban religious tests for public office. And this is in Article 6, Section 3. And this is actually the only mention of religion in the original unamended document. And if you remember back to your high school history or social studies classes, you may remember that the Constitution is often a deliberately vague document. You know, the founders sort of laid out a framework and knew that later generations were going to come in and fill that in, right? So there's often this sort of vague, nebulous language. But if you look at the ban on religious tests in Article 6, that ban is some of the most clear and emphatic clear and emphatic language in a document that's often deliberately vague. Again, right? Like it says, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust. No, shall, ever, any. I mean, it's clear and emphatic language. And then, after all of that, you have the First Amendment, which separates church and state and guarantees religious freedom. Now, I am a constitutional attorney. I've written books about this, and I will be the first to tell you that there is a whole lot that is wrong with our Constitution. There's a lot that I would change if I were given a magic wand. But those secular foundations are what made it unique. And they are genuine contributions, not just to political science and thought, but to humanity. And those contributions are threatened and undermined and under attack by white Christian nationalism. And that's why the subtitle of my first book, which is called The Founding Myth, is Christian Nationalism is Un-American. Because Christian nationalism is a betrayal of the few founding principles about which we can truly be proud. Christian nationalism is a betrayal of America. And the flip side of that is that the separation of church and state is a cure for white Christian nationalism. And that's why it's also the first target. Right? The wall of separation between church and state is not a wall that divides us. It's a wall that protects us. It's a wall that allows us to flourish. Back in 1948, long before the Supreme Court was captured, it explained that, quote, separation means separation, not something less. Jefferson's metaphor in describing the relation between church and state speaks of a wall of separation, not of a fine line easily overstepped. So think about all that church-state separation does for us when that wall of separation is tall and strong and impregnable. Like, you want better education? You want full funding for public schools instead of vouchers for private religious schools? You want accurate science about evolution and sex taught in classrooms? Do you want full civil and political rights for LGBTQ plus folks and women and minorities? Do you want a greener world and a healthier environment? Do you want America to get serious about global climate change and shun its deniers? Do you want access to better and universal health care? Do you want scientific research to be guided by scientists? Do you want our responses to pandemics to be guided by science? Do you want reproductive justice and choice to be fully realized? You end Christian nationalism. You separate church and state, and you're going to see progress on every one of those issues. And let me just give you one particularly poignant example that I think will transition into Katherine's next question here about how church-state separation connects to other issues in ways that people may not realize. And so I want to talk about Missouri. In Missouri, the legislators there banned abortion. And abortion bans violate the separation of church and state because they impose one narrow religious view on us all. And nowhere is that more clear than in Missouri. Missouri legislators literally wrote into their abortion ban that, quote, Almighty God is the author of life. Almighty God is the author of life is in the text of that law. And during the debate, the legislators there repeatedly said the quiet part out loud. Just a couple examples. As a Catholic, I do believe that life begins at conception. Here's another. God doesn't give us a choice in this area. He's the creator of life. And another was, being from the biblical side of it, I always believe that life does occur at the point of conception. So my organization, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, alongside the National Women's Law Center, sued. We challenged Missouri's abortion bans as a violation of church-state separation. We represent 14 faith leaders from 7 different denominations, and our clergy plaintiffs support abortion access, not in spite of their faith, but because of their religious beliefs and their commitment to church-state separation. And by the way, I mean, church-state separation is what protects true religious freedom. That's why so many clergy joined this lawsuit. It's the reason that so many Americans believe in so many different religions. So if you are a believer and you oppose church-state separation, you might ask yourself whether the people in power share every one of your beliefs or not, because they almost certainly don't. And without church-state separation, they are coming for your freedom in the future too. You're only, safe without church-state separation as long as it's your people in power. And that is what Christian nationalism is really all about. So church-state separation protects us all. And I will pause there and leave it there. But I am happy to get into the question about the Equal Rights Amendment. I do think there's a difference between nationalism and national policy, and there's also a difference between nationalism and patriotism. I think it might make sense if we wait till our Q&A here. But I'm happy to do that, and I even will get to bring in one of my favorite writers of all time if we do that, James Baldwin. So,
Katherine, additional comments and enlightenment.
Sure. I mean, that was amazing, Andrew, as always. Today's reactionary religious activists often say that the separation of church and state is something new, or we've pushed it further than the founders intended, or they say it's a misinterpretation, or it's not of the Constitution. And to be sure, I think we could argue that in some regards, or in some instances, it's taking on different nuances. But one thing the founders were absolutely clear on was the question of taxation. There has absolutely been backward movement because our founders were really clear that any form of government money for any church or religious organization was unacceptable. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson thought the very definition of tyranny was, as they put it, to tax Peter to pay for the religion of Paul. They called it tyranny. They said repeatedly that citizens should not have to pay to support religions they did not wish to support. They were really adamant about that. And the reality today is that taxpayers, you and I, are subsidizing religion in all kinds of ways, including tax exemptions and subsidies and direct funding of religious organizations, including those that hold us with contempt, through a variety of means. And for the religious right, it is still not enough. I mean, there's an adage in the world of journalism, follow the money. A lot of it is all about the money. So ironically, religious organizations and initiatives are getting more tax subsidies than ever before. I'll give you just one example: crisis pregnancy centers, which now take in nearly $100 million or more every single year in direct taxpayer funding. The state of Ohio alone spent $14 million last year on right-wing faith-based programs. They act like medical care, right? They promise they're going to give medical care to women experiencing pregnancy that might have been unintended. but instead they exist to evangelize women and turn them into a very particular type of conservative Christian and control their reproductive behavior. And they often provide incredibly misleading information, misleading health information. Another example is vouchers for religious schools, which also direct many millions of dollars in taxpayer funding to religious groups that are free to teach, contempt toward people of other faiths or creationism, or have their students sign, anti-abortion guidelines and things like that. But, reactionaries on the Supreme Court and their allies who are part of the sort of right-wing legal ecosystem are demanding more. They want the government to pay directly for religious schools. There are cases in Oklahoma, and Andrew, you may be more up on this than me. There may be some other cases where they're actually trying to obtain direct funding for religious charter schools. So not paying tax to support any church you don't want was one of the clearest aims of our framers of the Constitution, but today we're really far away from that. So that's all I have to add.
Wow. And that leads directly into the next question, which is mainly for Katherine. Describe the many ways that Christian nationalism hurts women and feminists, including reproductive rights, public education, and many other aspects of equality. So continue on, Katherine.
Apologies for that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I hope we've made clear that Christian nationalism is really harmful to democracy. It's an anti-democratic ideology and movement, and it hurts everyone. But women are very directly impacted. We're impacted in our workplaces, in our homes, our bodies and lives are impacted. And I want to get into that too. Authoritarian movements come to power by exploiting gender inequality and gender anxieties. They remain in power by imposing those hierarchies, and the attack on women's rights is always part of an attack on democracy. The authoritarian mindset fears disorder, it fears women's power. So controlling women is central to its vision of controlling society. So I just want to start by examining what the ban on abortion is really about. Depriving women of reproductive rights isn't just a consequence of anti-abortion politics. It's the point of the exercise. They're going after women's reproductive rights because we are women. They're not, after all, going after prescriptions of Viagra for unmarried men, which could also be used to sin. Abortion bans deny us the most fundamental conditions for our physical and psychological integrity, for maternal health, and for the ability to decide our relationships and our futures. Too often, I think, supporters of abortion rights frame the anti-abortion movement in narrow terms. We think it's just an issue of fetal development, or think that the only people whose rights are at stake are women who are seeking to terminate their pregnancies. But abortion has never just been about abortion. It was never just an isolated policy preference among some people with certain religious convictions. It is really one piece of this radical movement working toward a transformation and indeed destruction of our democracy. We really need to talk about it as such. You can't take away the rights of people who are seeking abortions without taking away the rights of all people who get pregnant, whether they're seeking abortion or not. Anti-abortion law kills mothers. I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to try not to cry. I know this to be true firsthand because in 2003, I was denied treatment at a Catholic hospital when I was experiencing a miscarriage for a pregnancy I very much wished to carry to term. We were trying to have our second child. I bled out in the emergency room. No one would treat me. I lost 40% of my blood and very nearly died before receiving the abortion that saved my life, all to satisfy the anti-abortion policies of a Catholic hospital where I'd been taken for treatment. Frankly, I'm lucky to be alive. My story is so common. It's very difficult for people to relive and go public with the hardest, about the hardest day of their life, to prove what shouldn't have to be proven, that people experiencing problems in pregnancy or miscarriage, experiencing medical emergency, deserve to be treated with best practices medicine and not according to religious ideology. This happened in New York City, in a blue city in a blue state. But there are so many stories that are just so far worse than mine. 1 in 4 pregnancies ends in miscarriage. Complications are not uncommon. And we're seeing really alarming trends in maternal health, particularly among women of color, who are nearly 3 times as likely to die in pregnancy from a pregnancy-related cause as white women. The logic that would ban abortion, the idea that they repeat that a blastocyst or an embryo or a fetus is the moral equivalent of a born child, this would outlaw many of those popular and effective forms of birth control and make IVF virtually impossible. What these bans do is that they mark out half of the population as being members of a subordinate group in society, people whose bodies are property of the state. You're designating half of humanity for a distinct and subservient role. And this has a knock-on effect in every aspect of society. It shows up in lower pay, wide-scale workplace discrimination, in media and cultural depictions of women as subordinate. When you have a subclass of women with no control over our most fundamental freedoms, it impacts how all women are perceived and treated. So it's, religion determining social policy can so easily become a tool for imposing gender hierarchies and social control. What we're hearing from this movement is more and more extreme. The idea of male headship in this movement is really normalized. The idea that men should lead at home and at church. And we're even hearing more and more voices from this movement talk about household voting. This is the idea that a woman's vote essentially belongs to her husband because the supposed head of household gets the final say when it comes to vote. People who have endorsed this idea have been invited to speak at the Republican National Convention. So these ideas are really, I'm just hearing more and more voices arguing for this because I think they're quite panicked that a lot of women are really not on board with this radical agenda. I want to shift for a moment to public education, since this is another key area of focus for the right. I spoke before about how it's all about the money. So I'm sure you guys have noticed that there's kind of wars heating up around public education, and they're kind of built on an alliance between what I call the proselytizers and the privatizers. The people sort of promoting religion in public schools, promoting a particular religion in public schools, sort of conservative or reactionary varieties of Christianity, and those who are trying to privatize public schools in order to siphon money from the public school system and send it off to religious schools and charters. But, what started off looking like an alliance is really now clearly a merger because they're often the same people. They're going after kids because they know this is where religious identities are formed. You ever heard the phrase, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world? Or give me the child at 7, I'll show you the adult. I hear these types of phrases at the right-wing conferences I attend, which is where I do my research, or some of it. So we can't forget how much money is involved in public K-12 education. It's on the order of close to $800 billion a year. And so far-right activists are really looking for ways to channel public money into their religious mission and their power. And at a time when many churches are frankly losing membership, thanks to this sort of extremism that's turning so many people off. It's like the moderate middle that's losing ground. A lot of the more, mainline denominations are sort of thinning out and aging. And then it's some of the more sort of hotter and harder forms of religion that are sort of thriving, actually. So they know if they can capture like a portion of this sort of budget for themselves, they can sustain themselves on the public dime, or sort of grow on the public dime. So there's a really Orwellian aspect to the strategy on the part of the religious right. They're weaponizing religious freedom in order to impose their religion on others. They're weaponizing the rhetoric of market fundamentalism to create a stream of profits that are parasitic on the public treasury. They're weaponizing the idea of free speech to suppress the kinds of speech they don't like. You know, they denounce public schools because they say they're woke, but they, you know, public schools don't teach CRT. I mean, those terms CRT and DEI are basically just a form of race baiting. But they make no bones about the fact that their goal is to indoctrinate children in their preferred ideologies. There's nothing conservative about this agenda. It's radical, and gutting public education is at the heart of it.
Andrew, want to add on, and also about the demonstration tomorrow in Washington for the Supreme Court hearings on EMTALA?
Yeah, I was going to mention the Supreme Court is hearing the EMTALA case tomorrow morning, oral argument, and there will be a rally out in front. Americans United for Separation of Church and State CEO Rachel Lazar will be speaking, I believe around 11:15, 11:30 or so. And I'll certainly be listening to the case. I'll just add one thing to Catherine's answer there. And I just remember back to June 1st, 2020. This is when Trump had peaceful protesters gassed and beaten and brutalized with rubber bullets so that he could walk to a church and pose with a Bible. And the point of that malignant stroll was to show that Trump and this nation are churched, that we're Bible believing and Bible beating, that we are a Christian nation, and anyone who disagrees should be beaten and gassed. And again, the goal of Christian nationalism is to rewrite or redefine the Constitution so that it creates two classes of people: the right kind of conservative Christian and everyone else. Conservative, white, heteronormative Christian men are going to be the favored in group that the law protects but does not bind. And everybody else is going to be the disfavored out group, the others, which the law binds but does not protect. And this is the point that I really want to make here, is that there is no amount of power or privilege that is going to satisfy the Christian nationalists in this country. They will not stop until we stop them. They are coming for contraception. They are coming for a nationwide abortion ban. They're coming for marriage equality. They want an unfettered right to discriminate. They are openly talking about repealing the 19th Amendment, as Katherine mentioned. Like, they want to be a special favored class and everyone else to be second-class citizens. That is the end goal of the movement.
Okay, last question. Thank you. Describe, this is for Andrew to start again. Describe the scope and ways people are influenced to support Christian nationalism and how it relates to partisan politics and the upcoming U.S. elections.
So first, a disclaimer. I work at Americans United for Separation of Church and State, which is a 501c3. We are nonpartisan, nonprofit, and I am not speaking on their behalf or endorsing or opposing any candidates in what I am about to say. My great fear for this election and the way that Christian nationalism is going to influence this election is political violence. The popular vote margin in the last election was 7 million votes, but the election was decided by 40,000 votes in 3 states. That's like half a Taylor Swift concert. And so every single vote matters. And that gives the violence that is inherent in white Christian nationalist movement an outsized impact. And if you remember back to the midterms, we actually did see some dry runs for voter intimidation. We saw armed militia at the polls in Arizona. We've since seen Christian nationalist leaders calling on the mob to head into cities in swing states and to police the polls. So I am deeply, deeply worried about the prospect for political violence this cycle. And that was what January 6th was all about. And Katherine and I both contributed to a report that explored the role of Christian nationalism in the January 6th insurrection. That was produced by the Baptist Joint Committee and the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Amanda Tyler also contributed to it, Jamar Tisby and Thea Butler. A lot of the experts in this Christian nationalist space and scholars contributed to that report and detailed the role that Christian nationalism played in January 6th. And the goal of the violence of January 6th, at least from the inner circle, was not actually to stop the count or to necessarily overthrow the government. It was actually to create enough chaos to throw the election to the House of Representatives, where each state delegation, each state, gets one vote for president. Right? That was at the real goal kind of at the heart of that. And in that scenario in 2020 and likely in 2024, Trump comes out as president. No matter what the popular vote says, no matter what the Electoral College says, if there's enough chaos, the vote goes to the House of Representatives and they are the ones that are going to decide the election, each state getting one vote, each state delegation. So that's terrifying. All right. And that is to me the big way that this election could be influenced by Christian nationalism. So let me temper that with a little bit of good news. Let's look at how some of the Christian nationalist candidates fared in the 2022 midterms, where it looked like, for the most part, Christian nationalism was a liability. People were voting against extremism, and Christian nationalism is religious extremism. So first, there were actually quite a few Christian nationalists that lost early on. They lost in the primaries, and that turned out to be a signal of things to come. Idaho Lieutenant Governor Janice McGeachin tried to primary her governor and lost. You may remember her from her ad where she was posing with a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other. She hosted a mask burning and said that God calls us to pick up the sword and fight, and Christ will reign in the state of Idaho if she was elected. She lost. Arkansas State Senator Jason Rapert ran for lieutenant governor. Rapert was the driving force behind the Ten Commandments monument at the Arkansas Capitol. He also created something called the National Association of Christian Lawmakers, which pushes Christian nationalist bills in all 50 states. It's sort of like a Project Blitz. He lost. Unfortunately, Sarah Sanders then put him on the library board in that state, so he's wreaking havoc there now. Rick Saccone lost his bid for Pennsylvania lieutenant governor, and he was actually at the insurrection. He posted live video from the insurrection. He said, we're here live in front of the U.S. Capitol. Hundreds of thousands of people are storming the Capitol. They broke down the gates. They're macing them up there. We're trying to run out all the evil people, right? I mean, he said our vanguard broke through the barricades, and he ends the video, until next time, in God we trust, right? Which is the very popular phrase with Christian nationalists. There's another Tennessee state rep, Terry Lynn Weaver, who was also, she bragged about being, quote, in the thick of it on January 6th. She called the January 6th mob a bunch of patriots. She lost. Now, there were, of course, plenty of Christian nationalists that just cruised through the primaries and even on to victory, right? Marjorie Taylor Greene proudly adopts that label. Lauren Boebert, Mary Miller, all in U.S. Congress. You may remember Miller. She was the representative who favorably quoted Hitler at a rally the day before the insurrection, and then we kind of all forgot about it in the news of January 6th. We kind of forgot that there was a U.S. rep who favorably quoted Hitler. And Miller actually objected to the electoral certifications from Arizona and Pennsylvania in the House. She claimed that our nation was founded as a Christian nation, which again is the defining belief of Christian nationalism. Oh, and by the way, her husband is an Illinois state rep who ran unopposed for re-election. He also live streamed video from the Trump rally on January 6th and has questionable ties to the 3 Percenters, which are a militia group. We did see losses at the governor level, though not necessarily the underperformance. And again, DeSantis won in Florida, Abbott won in Texas, but Kari Lake in Arizona lost, Dan Cox in Maryland lost. As did Maryland Lieutenant gubernatorial candidate Michael Petruk. I'm not sure how you actually say his last name, but he was in my first book, The Founding Myth. And then Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania. He didn't just lose, he lost badly by about 15 points. And this is kind of a big deal because he was a truly virulent and unabashed Christian nationalist, one of the most extreme people, not just candidates. He's featured pretty prominently in our January 6th report and in the testimony that I gave to Congress alongside that. He was aligned with Andrew Torba, who founded the online cesspool of bigotry known as Gab. Torba also wrote a book advocating Christian nationalism that's subtitled A Biblical Guide for Taking Dominion and Discipling Nations. So that's what lost. And then finally, pretty much every Christian nationalist who was running to control our elections lost, like Mark Fincham in Arizona and Christina Caramo in Michigan, making it much harder for the election to be stolen. So I'm going to I'll wrap up here, I think, and then we can open it to Q&A. You know, we call them Christian nationalists because they want a Christian nation. They wrongly think we were founded as a Christian nation. But America will never be a Christian nation, because the moment it becomes a Christian nation, it will cease to be America. Christian nationalism is fundamentally opposed to the aspirational values that we have yet to live up to. Values like we the people, meaning all the people, and equal justice under law, and those other founding maxims. Right? These are the values that we fight for every day at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And these are the values that Christian nationalists are fighting against. Christian nationalists are not just wrong about what America is and how it was founded. Their beliefs and identity run counter to the ideals on which this nation was founded. They really are un-American. And they're also pretty unpopular. And I think this goes to the question here, the politics of Christian nationalism. Their beliefs are really wildly unpopular, right? They oppose marriage equality. 71% of Americans support it. They want to outlaw abortion. 85% of Americans think it should be legal in some way, shape, or form. They want a nation of Christians like them. 73% of Americans are more welcoming of religious pluralism. And again, they almost certainly want to ban contraception too, but something like 91% of Americans are in favor. And those numbers terrify them. They are scared. They're scared because the nuns, NONES, non-religious Americans, are on the rise, because Americans are leaving religion behind, because we elected our first Black president, and we have a Black female vice president, because of marriage equality, because every day we are closer to racial and gender and LGBTQ equality. So conservative white Christian American status as the dominant group is threatened. And it has been for some time. They're losing the culture wars, which I think is a silly phrase that's meant to mask attacks on human rights. They're losing the power and the privilege and the deference which they believe they are due. And we know that when a dominant group or caste in a society feels its status threatened, that it reacts or overreacts by trying to retain that status, to holding on to that power and privilege. That's why they're turning to Christian nationalism. That's why they turned to the violent insurrection that we saw on January 6th. They are raging against the dying of their privilege. And I will stop there and turn it back to you, Sue, or Catherine. You should add to it, I guess, if you want, and then we can maybe do Q&A.
Can I just ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
You were naming a lot of the Christian nationalists that were defeated in the last election.
Mm-hmm.
What about those who are running now, like the lieutenant governor of North Carolina?
Well, I mean, it's certainly, I mean, that's what I'm going to be watching, and I'm personally, doing a lot of work towards. I mean, those losses have not stopped Christian nationalists from running for office, or people from running for office on platforms of Christian nationalism. We're definitely still seeing that happen. Again, they are raging against the dying of their privilege, and that rage is coming out in a number of different ways, not just violence, but also seeing people run for higher office. So, I mean, that's one of the big questions for me in this election, is how is Christian nationalism going to fare? Because the difference between the 2022 midterms and now is Trump is on the ballot on this one. And, I mean, if you go read Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry's work, Trump rode this wave, this undercurrent of Christian nationalism into office in his first term. And the question is, are we going to see a repeat of that, or are we going to see a repeat of 2020 where we held fast against that wave of Christian nationalism?
Catherine, do you want to add on?
Well, I just want to thank Andrew for doing the yeoman's work of pulling together the report on Christian nationalism in the January 6th insurrection. It's from the Baptist Joint Committee. I can't post it into the chat, unfortunately, but if anybody's interested, it's well worth a read. You can Google Baptist Joint, bjconline.org, and then January 6 report, or Jan 6 report. And it's really well worth the read. Really fantastic contributors. Would not have happened without Andrew's leadership. So thank you so much for that.
Okay. And now we get to follow Andrew's suggestion. And the first question is, how can we better defend the Equal Rights Amendment against Christian nationalism in our upcoming work? Andrew, do you want to take the lead on that first?
Sure. So I think we wanted to do a little bit of disentangling of terms here, right? There's national policy, there's nationalism, and there's patriotism. And you know, the ERA it's a national policy that we certainly want to get passed, but that's a very distinct thing from nationalism, which is another distinct thing from patriotism. And you know, one of the fair criticisms that I often get is for calling Christian nationalism un-American, and I get this, I understand it, but I like to explain, you know, patriotism and nationalism are not the same thing, right? Nationalism is a jingoistic, fervent belief that one's country can do no wrong, that whatever it does is by definition right. It's blind, unthinking loyalty. Patriotism is different. It's perhaps, here's my chance, best summed up by James Baldwin, who said, "I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." You know, I think the only possible place where patriotism and nationalism overlap is when you're watching the Olympics and you can just cheer for your country no matter what. But patriotism has no religion. Patriotism has no religion. And you know, one of the goals of my first book is to remind folks of who the true heirs of the American experiment are. That it's those of us who are skeptical and unorthodox and who believe that it's okay to swim against the current. It's okay to be different, who believe in the freedom of religion, and that there's no such thing as the freedom of religion without a government that is free from religion. Those of us who, as John F. Kennedy said, believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, right? Those people are the true heirs of the American experiment, the true patriots, not the Christian nationalists. So to me, those two things are very, very distinct. And then I think you have to separate nationalism from national policy. And certainly Christian nationalism is careening towards some deeply terrifying national policies. Again, you know, the national abortion ban, coming for contraception, coming for marriage equality, you know, coming again. I mean, I've hammered this point home enough. So I think those things are just very distinct, and not to be confused. And to me, that question kind of conflated those a little bit. So I thought that would have been the most helpful way to answer that question. Katherine, I don't know if you want to add to that either.
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, religious nationalism is a kind of exclusionary, identitarian form of nationalism. It's an idea of who gets to properly belong in a country and who doesn't. I mean, when you see Christian nationalist leaders in America say you're with us or you're against us, you're the pure versus the impure. I think sometimes it's easier to recognize actually when it's happening in other countries. So when you have a leader like Vladimir Putin in Russia, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, or leaders in Iran, they bind themselves very tightly to ultra-conservative religious figures in their own countries to consolidate more authoritarian forms of political power. They do it to suppress any dissent, suppress freedom of speech. They do it to bubble wrap themselves in sanctimony. It's like saying, you can't touch me. I've got the holy men on my side. They're guarding against any check on their power, critique of their corruption, or the harms that they are perpetrating against their own people. So It's a tool. It's like a tool for authoritarianism. This sort of, and you see this with Trump when he does his rallies. He often has a preacher to his right and a preacher to his left. He's saying, "See, you can't touch me because I got, you know, the holy guys on my side." And then there's one other thing I want to address. Like, look, this movement is a minority of people who sort of lend their support to this movement are a minority of this population. They only have the power that they do because they vote in disproportionate numbers. They punch above their political weight, precisely because that machine of the Christian nationalist movement, that deep organizational machine, turns out the vote in huge numbers. They're just very effective at it. They, you know, sort of propagandize people, and then they, you know, make them think that they have to vote, and then they turn them out to vote on their so-called biblical values. But those of us who reject this agenda are the majority of this country. Most Americans, religious and non-religious alike, reject the politics of conquest and division that this movement represents. So when we talk about what we can do, I mean, you know, I do a lot of my research by going to these right-wing conferences and strategy gatherings, and you know, I heard Ralph Reed, who is one of the movement's very seasoned strategists. He said, "Pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day." And he's right. I mean, mobilizing the vote, protecting the vote, organizing people in your circle to vote, you know, in all of these different ways is absolutely critical. I mean, there are things that we can do as individuals, like show up to vote on elections and make sure to vote not just for the top of the ticket, but also down ballot for people who reflect your values, but also to you know, join together with others and find organizations that are really sort of chime with your values and with your purpose. So I want to thank all of you again for joining together for this conversation, because you know, it's organizations like this one and people like you that give me hope.
Thanks. I think we have some urgent questions from the audience. And so if you all don't mind, let's plan to stay around for about 10 more minutes to take care of more of the questions. Is that okay with everybody?
I can stay for another 10, yes.
Thank you. Okay, Jan Erickson, the co-president of the Clearinghouse on Women's Issues, is going to see if there's any key questions from the chat.
Hi, I'm quickly looking through them. They came all of a sudden. For a while I thought we weren't going to have any questions. Lois Frankel says, making sure this went through from earlier, looking forward to examples of successful activities to push back against the Christian nationalist movement. Any rays of hope? I think that's what all of us are looking for. Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I actually, I have tremendous hope about the future. And I know that may be confusing given some of what I was saying, but the wellspring of my hope is this basic definitional truth. Their power-hungry aggression is growing our movement. Right, their wins in Dobbs in the abortion case, right, in the 303 creative case, which said that you could you know, discriminate against LGBTQ folks. Every policy win, every win that they get in our captured Supreme Court, every political win that they get alienates more people and swells our ranks. Right, the whole reason that we are seeing this in the first place is white Christian nationalists are working to privilege the chosen few. So by definition, every legislative and legal victory that they notch alienates more people and wakes more people up to the danger and drives more people away from their ideology. They're essentially creating a feedback loop. Their power-hungry aggression is growing our movement. And I think Katherine might back me up on this, but you know, we've been screaming about this for a long time. You know, I've been fighting Christian nationalism for almost 15 years, and there is a groundswell of opposition happening that I've never seen before. They are crusading because we are working to meet those unmet promises in the US Constitution. Again, that simple idea that we the people means everyone, means all the people. And as we continue to march toward that progress, the Christian nationalists are fighting ever harder against it, right? They're not going to go gently. They're going to rage against the dying of their privilege. But in the end, we are going to win because they fight only for themselves. And where they are selfish, we are selfless. They want supremacy. We want equality. That's why in the end, we're going to triumph. Not because our principle is inherently better than theirs, though it definitely is, but because the math is on our side. We have the numbers, as Katherine just pointed out. We are the majority. That's what they're fighting. That's what they're raging against. And you can rage, but you can't really fight math. And so I really do have a ton of hope, and I am seeing the tide turning.
Great. I even feel better listening to that, Andrew. Moving along, there is a note from Karen Humphrey about a Wednesday, May 1st, Gloria Steinem event the National Women's Political Caucus is holding. So if everybody will look at their chat and get those details and the links, that would be great. Christina Arnold, addressing everyone, said, as a trans woman that was raised by Christian nationalists during the Billy Graham Crusades, I'm so glad to see people doing this work. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Karen Humphrey adds, these are wonderful presentations. But like many of us here, I've been concerned about Christian nationalism for some time. How do we reach people who are either aren't engaged in politics or who don't know or trust those who are working against Christian nationalism? I think you've answered that in part already, Andrew. I don't know, Katherine, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's really vital to have those conversations with people who feel disenfranchised politically or feel like their vote doesn't count. Voting matters. I mean, nothing matters more than voting. And we can't, assume that because we live in a blue district or a blue state, say that that's going to dominate. People talk a lot about California as a blue state, but there's a tremendous amount of organizing in California. I mean, it may be a blue state, but there's a red wall in that state. And it's when people are very complacent that they can, that we get surprised by stuff. So, having those hard conversations is sometimes difficult to engage, but it's really important to do that as well. And I think, persuading people, sometimes it's all about, offering to babysit for that mom so she has time to get out of the house and vote, or drive that person who may be mobility impaired, say, can I drive you, to the polling station and drive you home, and make sure to bring water if it's still legal in your state to have a bottle of water while you're waiting to vote. I mean, the religious right is trying to do all these dirty tricks to inhibit voting rights in Democratic-leaning districts and disproportionately targeting districts of color. But we need to get out there in election cycles and really, right now, I think we're facing a real crisis within the Republican Party. 20 years ago, the candidates we're seeing today, the kinds of candidates you just didn't see them in quite the kind of rhetoric, the kind of extremism, in such numbers. But it seems like the gatekeeping institutions of the Republican Party have sort of fallen away. And the only way that party is really going to reform is if they receive a really strong rebuke at the ballot box.
I just want to add to that, because I think it's so important that we have the hard conversations, as Katherine said. And I actually think that's more important now than ever before, because we know that the way that people are getting their information and their news, and which is how we influence votes, is changing. Right. So, 10 years ago, most of it was coming to people through social media. 20 years ago, most of it was coming through TV and kind of broadcast news. Now we are learning that most people are getting their information from their friends and family, from their group chats, from their text messages, things like that. And that makes having those hard conversations now more important than ever before. And so the two things I always like to mention to people are, one, while you're having those those conversations, temper your expectations. You are never going to change somebody's mind in one conversation. Your goal should be to plant seeds of doubt and seeds of cognitive dissonance that will allow them to change their own minds in their own time. That's how you're going to persuade somebody. So don't go into it expecting that you'll be armed with all the facts and all the arguments and you're going to change somebody's mind right there. The goal is to get them to rethink things in their own time, so that they change their mind. You're never going to change somebody's mind for them. They have to change their mind on their own. And one of the other things to do then is to make sure that you end that conversation in a way that allows them to come back to you, where they have additional questions. That cognitive dissonance has been sitting there and kind of growing for them. They feel like they can come back to you and get more information from you. What's a book I could read? Where could I go get an answer? Things like that. So I would just think that's really especially crucial in this particular moment in time.
Well, we're at the end of our list of comments. People are heaping praise on our speakers, which is wonderful. I just would like to add that Sue and I attended a screening of a new film called Bad Faith. Sorry, I can't remember the whole title, but the four of us here on screen were all there. Americans United was one of the sponsors of this great screening. Scared the heck out of me. It's going to be available on Apple Plus for folks to watch about this whole Christian nationalist movement. And so if either one of you, Andrew or Katherine, want to say a couple words about that, we can later send out to the people who signed up for this program a link to information about it as well.
Well, let me jump in and say that there's two documentaries right now on Christian nationalism. Bad Faith, I think it's streaming everywhere on the 28th or 29th. And I think you can get it outside of even Apple. But the other one is actually based on Katherine's book, which is a remarkable book. It's called The Power Worshippers. If you have not read it, you owe it to yourself to get a copy and read it before this election. And that movie is called God and Country. It was produced by Rob Reiner, who I think everybody knows. Katherine's in it. She's amazing. And it's
not as funny as Spinal Tap, but
it's not as funny as some of Rob Reiner's other movies. But definitely worth your time.
Great. Well, at the very end of the chat list is a plug for people to look for the posting of this program on YouTube. And you can get the link from Ellen O'Connor's chat in the chat box. And unless anybody else has something to add, I think we will wrap it up. And this has been one of the best programs we've had, I think.
It was really
Thank you
fantastic.
thank you guys
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you so much for hosting us. It was
Thanks
a pleasure.
to everybody for participating.
Thank you so much, Katherine and Andrew, for a fantastic meeting and information. Goodbye, everybody.